Hey everyone, I'm Ben, the Amateur Exegete, and this is episode 74 of Bible Study for Amateurs. Today's episode is Elizabeth Shively's Purification of the Body and the Reign of God in the Gospel of Mark, Part 8. In Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45, Jesus encounters a man with lepra, and per verse 41, stretched out his hand and touched him. Such action, some have suggested, would have put Jesus at risk of acquiring the ritual impurity lepra conferred. In Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 20, Jesus encounters a demon-possessed man who dwelled among tombs. Per Numbers chapter 19, verse 16, coming into contact with graves caused ritual impurity, and therefore, Jesus' interaction with the demon-possessed man risked contraction of said impurity. In Mark chapter 5, verse 41, Jesus takes the hand of Jairus' deceased daughter. Per Numbers chapter 19, verse 11, those who touch dead bodies become ritually impure for 7 days, and so, it stands to reason, Jesus risked becoming ritually impure by taking the girl's hand. In Mark chapter 5, verse 27, Jesus' cloak is touched by one suffering from an abnormal genital discharge, that is, a flow of blood. Per Leviticus chapter 15, verses 25 through 27, coming into contact with things such a person has touched causes ritual impurity, and so Jesus' interaction with the woman risked him acquiring ritual impurity. What do we make of all this? These stories, as well as the exorcism in Mark chapter 9, verses 14 through 29, are enumerated by Elizabeth Shively in her 2020 piece, Purification of the Body and the Reign of God in the Gospel of Mark, where she ties them to the three sources of major ritual impurity, for which the Torah provides rectifying purity rituals. These sources are, of course, corpse contagion, scale disease, and abnormal genital discharges. In the pericopes just mentioned, Jesus encounters an individual who would have been considered ritually impure on account of their conditions, and yet he does not keep his distance from them. Indeed, in some of them, he takes the initiative to make contact. Yet, this raises a question that Shively, too, touches on. Why doesn't the evangelist narrate that by coming into contact with the ritually impure, Jesus, too, becomes ritually impure? There are a couple of ways to approach that question. The first is to acknowledge, as Shively does, the shared cultural encyclopedia of both the evangelist and his audience. Helen Bond observes that various lines of evidence suggest that Mark and his readership shared a similar heritage, and that the general contours of the material were known to the audience. For example, the author uses terms like baptism and gospel without feeling the need to clarify their meaning. Additionally, he brings characters like John the Baptist and Pilate onto the scene without much of an introduction. The call stories of Peter, Andrew, James, and John are terse and do not appear to be crafted with persuasion in mind. He freely quotes from the scriptures of Israel, treating them, sans apology, as authoritative. Finally, he uses the popular genre of biography as the vehicle by which he will communicate his story of Jesus. Taken together, it is undoubtedly the case that the evangelist and his audience had read from the same cultural encyclopedia, permitting him to avoid spilling ink on topics about which they were all aware. In reading the Gospel of Mark, however, it becomes clear that despite sharing an encyclopedia, Some members of the audience were missing a volume or two. For example, in Mark chapter 7, Pharisees and scribes take note that some of Jesus' disciples consumed their food without first washing their hands. In verses 3 and 4, the evangelist interrupts the narrative to offer an explanation as to why this would have been a concern. A few verses later, as he responds to his opponents, Jesus uses the word Corban, after which the evangelist again interjects with an explanatory note defining the term. The simplest explanation for these interjections is that some members of Mark's audience were not aware of these ideas, and therefore needed someone to explain them. A similar explanation holds for places in the Gospel wherein Jesus speaks an Aramaic phrase that is in turn rendered into Greek for the audience. For example, when Jesus raises Jairus' daughter from the dead, he says to her in Mark chapter 5, verse 41, Talitha cum, translated by Mark as meaning, "Little girl, get up." This suggests that the evangelist found it necessary to render into the native language of his audience terms from a foreign one. Given this evidence, it is entirely possible that the reason Jesus is not described as acquiring ritual impurity when he comes into contact with individuals no doubt suffering from it is because the audience would have simply assumed it, sharing a cultural encyclopedia with the Gospel's author. After all, the concept of ritual impurity was not unique to either ancient Israelite religion or Second Temple Judaism. Thus, even non-Jews may have understood Mark's Jesus to be either risking acquiring ritual impurity or actually doing so. Another approach to the question is related to the previous one, namely that perhaps the reason the evangelist fails to discuss Jesus acquiring ritual impurity through contact is because it was too mundane a thing to detail. While the Markan author was certainly trying to compose a kind of biography of his protagonist, this task was not done in some disinterested fashion, with an eye toward marking every single action Jesus ever undertook. Unlike Matthew or Luke, there are no narratives of Jesus' birth and childhood. Should we infer from this that Jesus was neither born nor had a childhood? Of course not. Mark also lacks any description of Jesus laughing. Should we conclude then that Jesus never laughed? It's doubtful. The evangelist also fails to describe Jesus' bathroom habits. Must we then believe, on the basis of that omission, that Jesus neither urinated nor defecated? Meganoita. Mark would surely agree with the words of the Johannine evangelist. Jesus said and did many other things that are not written in his account of Jesus' life. A third approach is one briefly described here by Shively, though it is discussed later in her article. Jesus so embodies purity that contact with him results in what Darrell Bach describes as a touch of reversal. This idea is perhaps seen most clearly in Mark chapter 5, verses 28 through 30. "For," she said, "if I but touch his cloak, I will be made well." Immediately her flow of blood stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my cloak?" As Candida Moss observed, just as the woman is described as leaky, so too Jesus can be understood as leaking power. Important to note is that the evangelist describes a unilateral direction of force from Jesus to the woman, and not vice versa. Whatever impurity the woman suffered as a result of her medical condition, it did not transfer to Jesus. Rather, as God's Holy One, the power he possesses overcomes impurity wherever it is encountered. To make sense of the ritual purity system, one must look to the deity standing behind it. "I am the Lord your God, The deity declares in Leviticus chapter 11, verse 44, "Sanctify yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy." In context, Yahweh is instructing Moses and Aaron about what the people of Israel may or may not eat with regards to animals. Writes Shively, God's holiness is the ground for the prohibition against eating unclean creatures. While the precise meaning of the underlying Hebrew root, kaf dalet shin, is debated, Shively understands it to mean set-apartness. She writes, God is holy because he is uniquely great and uniquely good. Hence, for God to dwell with Israel, Israel must be holy, or set apart. And so, in various places within the Torah, Moses and the Israelites are given instructions about how to be set apart, often grounded in the declaration that the deity himself is holy. Indeed, writes Shively, God's holiness is the foundation for the entire purity system and its various rituals. It is on account of the deity's holiness that those suffering from impurity are not permitted near his dwelling place. Yahweh tells Moses in Numbers chapter 5, verses 1 through 3, "Command the Israelites to put out of the camp everyone who has a defiling skin disease or a discharge, and everyone who is unclean through contact with a corpse. You shall put out both male and female, putting them outside the camp. They must not defile their camp, where I dwell among them." Writing on this passage, Jacob Milgram noted, "It is not the threat of contagion to man and his objects that causes the banishment. Rather, as the text makes amply clear, it is the threat to the sanctuary, that is, the camp in whose midst I dwell." Shively, observing that the three major sources of ritual impurity are here connected, writes that while they are not all essentially related, these sources of impurity take on meaning as a category through the corresponding rituals that God commands. Notably, they share characteristics with one another in terms of consequences and requirements, and they are akin to unintentional sins in that the purification requirements are the same. In Leviticus chapter 4, Yahweh gives Moses instructions for circumstances wherein a person sins unintentionally in any of the Lord's commandments about things not to be done and does any of them. There are rules for anointed priests, the congregation at large, a ruler of the people, and ordinary people. Common to all of them is the hat ta'at, rendered in the NRSV Updated Edition as purification offering. This offering is also connected to those suffering from ritual impurity. In Leviticus chapter 14, the Metzorah, the one suffering from Sahra'at, is required to bring to the priest 2 male lambs and a female lamb. One of those lambs, per verse 13, was to be taken by the priest, who then was to slaughter the lamb in the place where the purification offering and the burnt offering are slaughtered in the holy place. A few verses later, in verse 19, we read that the priest shall offer the purification offering for the one to be cleansed from his uncleanness. In Leviticus chapter 15, the Zavah, a woman with an abnormal discharge of blood, is required to bring either 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons to the priest, and he will, verse 30 reads, offer one for a purification offering and the other for a burnt offering. And the priest shall make atonement on her behalf before the Lord for her unclean discharge. In Numbers chapter 19, corpse impurity is remedied when, in addition to bathing, ashes from the burnt purification offering are added to a vessel with running water and then sprinkled on the unclean on the 3rd and 7th days. Shively writes that while both the unintentional sins of Leviticus 4 and the various kinds of ritual impurity are essentially unrelated physical states that are inimical to life with a holy God and require rectifying purification, one of the key differences between them is that ritual impurity is not, in and of itself, sinful. But what connects the major sources of impurity together? What is so offensive about corpse contamination, skin diseases, and abnormal genital discharges? The answer, Shively informs us, is their connection to death. For this, she draws upon the work of Jacob Milgrom, who, in his commentary on Leviticus, wrote, "Their common denominator is death. Vaginal blood and semen represent the forces of life. Their loss? Death. In the case of scale disease, this symbolism is made explicit. Aaron prays for his stricken sister, 'Let her not be like a corpse.' Furthermore, scale disease is powerful enough to contaminate by overhang, and it is no accident that it shares this feature with the corpse. The wasting of the body, the common characteristic of all biblically impure skin diseases, symbolizes the death process as much as the loss of blood and semen." While our author notes how some scholars have sought to provide more nuance to Milgrom's contention by tying ritual impurity to mortality rather than death, she contends that the connection between ritual impurities and death is nevertheless expressed implicitly and explicitly among some Jewish groups, particularly those responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls. For example, in 4Q 274, we find an extended discussion of ritual impurity concerning those with genital discharges. The opening of the text, however, seems to be discussing the Metzorah, as indicated by the statement in 1.1 verses 3 and 4. "Unclean, unclean, he will shout all the days." But soon the discussion turns to the Zavah. She is not to touch a man with a zav, a discharge, nor anything he has come into contact with. If she does, she is required to wash her clothes and herself before she's allowed to eat. Additionally, she is not permitted to mingle in any way during her 7-day period, lest she contaminate the camps of the holy ones of Israel. More important for our purposes, and Shively's argument, is what we find in 1.1 verses 8 and 9. There we read that those who come into contact with impure persons like the Zavah are like whoever is impure through contact with a corpse. Given how serious corpse impurity was considered to be, that those with abnormal discharges are considered to be akin to those who suffer from corpse impurity speaks volumes. The same is true of the Metzorah. In 4Q 272, Tzara'at is connected to a Ruach, who enters into a person's body, causing one's artery to move upwards or downwards. This condition can only be reversed when a different Ruach, Ruach HaChaim, goes up and down and the flesh has grown. Writes Shively, in this case, impurity, death, and evil spirits are joined. These sectarian texts suggest that some ancient Jews tied impurity specifically to death and the work of evil spirits. What does any of this have to do with the Gospel of Mark? In various pericopes that feature people suffering from ritual impurity, Shively sees death as the common factor to them all. Whether it's the lepros of Mark chapter 1 verse 40, whose skin condition may have made him appear corpse-like, or the demoniac of Mark chapter 5 verses 1 through 20, who lives among the tombs of the dead, or the woman with the abnormal discharge of blood in Mark chapter 5 verses 24 through 34, whose flow of blood represents loss of life, These stories by the evangelists communicate ritual impurities deathly, Paul. But they are, Shively contends, not without remedy. She writes, "The informed audience might infer that as the embodiment of impurity, Jesus inaugurates the reign of God by rectifying, through his healings and exorcisms, that which causes the most potent disruption in the divine-human relations, death. Ultimately, Mark will present the rectification of impurity through Jesus' embodiment of purity in his own resurrection from death in the account of the empty tomb." To strengthen her argument, she turns to the second phenomena, whereby the Jewish scriptures make provision for the rectifying purification of the body, namely the eradication of natural disabilities at the commencement of the reign of God. We will discuss that next time. That's all the time we've got this episode. I'll see you next time, and remember, in the words of Richard Elliott Friedman, one does not need to deny what is troubling about the Bible in order to pay respect to what is heartening.